Hi, welcome to the August 10th meeting of the CNCF IoT Edge Working Group. On today's agenda, I'm going to be talking a little bit on a recap of a recent open source conference that had 3 good sessions that addressed running things at Edge. And I believe the agenda also includes a discussion of the white paper this group is working on. And we may have time for user nominated additional items or just free-form birds of a feather discussion. So I think all of you were here when I posted that link in the chat to the agenda notes document. I'm away from home, so a limited, little bit debilitated presentation. So maybe I'm just going to open the notes and read it, and I don't really have a slide deck or anything to go with it. But if you look on the agenda notes doc, there are links to get a lot of these, including the video recordings of the sessions I'm talking about. So this conference is called the Scale Conference, and it's the largest independent open source conference in North America, meaning independent means it's just kind of ad hoc local organizers that grew over time. This recent edition is the 19th. It literally started in somebody's dorm room on the campus of USC 19 years ago, and with under 20 people, but it has gained quite a bit of momentum. Before COVID hit, it was running 4,500 attendees. And this last one, they didn't know what to expect coming out of COVID, so they moved it from a convention center to a hotel. And the registrations hit 2,500, which was the cap for how much that could hold. So it was still a pretty good attendance. And independent means, it's not sponsored by a company or an open source foundation. One of the aspects of that is it's a little informal, with volunteers running even the AV and the Wi-Fi, but it's also inexpensive. That brings in a really diverse audience. So you can manage to attend there with a discount for maybe $45 or $50 pretty easily. And I don't know, it's really pretty much my favorite open source conference. So getting to what's of interest to this group, there were 3 talks. The first one was on the Podman container engine. So this talk was by Dan Walsh of Red Hat, who I think it's fair to say is the architect of Podman, or at least I'd consider it. He's been talking about it since I ever heard of it. And his talk was on recently added features plus things that are on the roadmap for the future. And there were some really interesting edge-related things on that list. So the first one is that it's added the ability to run edge applications using Kubernetes compatible pod YAML definitions. And when you do this, your application runs as a systemd unit. What this means is that at an edge leaf node, you don't have to install a full Kubernetes or even turn it into a Kubernetes worker cluster node like some of the open source solutions do. Instead, it's sufficient to just install the Podman engine. And in many aspects, you can manage this in a way similar to Kubernetes. It's designed to take a Kubernetes pod spec in YAML and run it. So the way that this is done, it does support things like volumes. Those volume specifications are converted to consume local storage on the host node. The goal, as I understand it, was to make Kubernetes YAML a viable replacement for using Docker Compose with Docker Compose YAML files. So that's the first edge-related feature. The second is support for WASM-based containers using OCI packaged runtime. So I know in this group we've talked before about WebAssembly, and it looks like that's an upcoming Podman feature to go package your WebAssembly in an OCI container and have the Podman engine run it for you at an edge location. There are also features for auto update of Podman when it's installed at the edge. So you can, if there are CVEs exposed, in theory, the thing is capable of keeping itself patched. And the final thing, I encourage you to watch the full presentation by Dan because it was very good. But the final thing I'm going to recap here is that the health metrics of Podman seemed very good. Dan had a slide of what I'm calling hard metrics. Soft metrics to me are things like GitHub stars that, I don't know, whenever I see a project touting those, since you can award those to yourself, I'm extremely skeptical. But the number of committers, the response time to PRs being submitted and PRs being merged, those kinds of things are kind of tough to game. And the Podman specs that he showed looked really good. He mentioned that when Docker changed the licensing for Docker Desktop, that had a big impact on Podman adoption. So that the speculation is that might have been a big influence on why the Podman metrics kind of went on turbocharge. Moving on, I'm going to talk about a second talk, which was on something I hadn't heard of until I saw this talk called WeirCan. And WeirCan was spun off, as I understand it, from the NARCS project. The NARCS project is a way for running what they call trusted executables on an appropriate CPU. And recent versions of AMD and Intel CPU chips have a mechanism of running VMs in an encrypted form in memory, so that in theory it's something like a TPM chip, but the entire VM is kept secure so that someone really can't hack in and see what's going on in there. And that idea could be potentially very important for a lot of edge applications where they're unattended, lack physical security. The TPM module can store secrets and things securely to some degree, but this NARCS project is a way to run whole VMs in this mode. And WeirCan spun off, if I understood the talk correctly, as a mechanism to make these secure VMs bootable. So WeirCan was designed to be a packaged unit where you can run a containerized app with the kernel to go with it and have this bare metal at edge boot off of an OCI container that contains both the kernel and the traditional app. And it was interesting, I didn't realize this, Docker containers generally use the kernel from the host, they inherit it. But apparently that's not actually a requirement. If you want to, you could put the kernel in that same container. It's just that to date, people haven't done that. But if you wanted to, the container gets larger, but it is possible to build yourself an OCI image that has both a kernel plus an application that runs on top of that kernel. And WeirCan does that. And they've got this technology working. It's published with an Apache license on GitLab, and I'll get to why it's on GitLab instead of perhaps a bit more popular GitHub in a moment, written in Rust. And you can boot up a bare metal device, Pixie, and a number of other forms, a number of other boot options covered in the presentation itself that I won't go into. But it will boot right out of a container, end up running a kernel that was packaged in the container along with your application, and do it in a secure mode. It runs entirely in memory, not on disk, so that's interesting, and it might have some implications. But because of this, it's really resistant to things like bricking. If you wanted to release a new kernel and you had a watchdog and the new one didn't come up, if you reconfigured to boot off the older version, you'd essentially have a form of atomic update of the OS packaged with your application. So I found that kind of interesting. Given that it runs entirely in memory, it might conceivably take more memory. The speaker said it is possible to use a disk that's there as swap for this thing, so that you maybe don't have to worry about that memory limitation. If you do need to persist state, you could mount volumes or state for configuration of network and other things is persisted in EFI variables. So I believe that if you have a UEFI BIOS, there's a limited amount of key value pairs that can be used to retain configuration. So WeirCan would use this. Looking at the notes I dropped in here, I think I've covered most of this. Oh, because it runs in this encrypted mode, given the appropriate hardware. And apparently the appropriate hardware takes a particular instruction set enhancement. They have acronyms, different ones for AMD versus Intel. And I can't recall what they were, but they're in that recorded presentation if you want to look them up. And it's only found on very recent ones, but speculation is that most of these instruction enhancements, if they follow history, will go down to the lesser CPUs. They kind of went into the server grade Xeons first. And I believe it will run without those. It's just that you can't guarantee you are running in the secure mode that would kind of deprecate the need for a TPM module at all, really. Finally, the saving the best for last, the presentation I recommend looking at is by Frederick Debian, who's on the call here. And he gave a talk entitled, "Should You Bring Kubernetes on Your Edge Road Trip?" And, it was a very broad coverage of various open source platforms available for Edge, both thick and thin, some optimized for different use cases compared to others. There was a slide with a very good table that I cut and pasted into the notes, covering, I don't know, I'll just read a few out of the list, AWS outputs, Eclipse, Fog, IOFog, and Fog 05, K3S, Fledge, KubeEdge, and more. And this table lists whether they're edge only or cloud managed, what their focus is, etc. And I do have a link to the recording on YouTube. I'll caution you on the recording, you jump to a particular place because Scale being kind of community managed, they just leave the camera more or less unattended running all day for a conference room. So when you find the recording on YouTube, every talk in that same room is on the same very long recording. So you have to go and jump to the part that you're interested in. But Frederick, I'll turn it over to you for a few remarks and, go ahead and brag if you like, and maybe you can say a few more words about your experience with the conference. Don't be afraid to offend me. If the conference sucked, tell people about it, because I might be biased since I'm an organizer.
Well, the location sucked proportionally, so to speak, but that's not the usual one. I mean, I know that they had to move it, and certainly I'm looking forward to get back next year, because in my opinion, it's been a great event, well run, with lots of, the kind of audience I need to reach to in my particular position at the foundation. So, only good things to say about it, apart from the fact that we were at a hotel literally besides the airport, not the best physical location, but for the rest, as an event, it's been great. And I love the community-oriented concept, game night, and the fact that people normally come there with kids, and that normally they would have been at under 18 speaking track as well. So all of those things are certainly good. And I must say I attended the Podman talk, Steve, that you talked about, and it's certainly a great one, and certainly piqued my interest in trying it out, given the limitations now around Docker desktop and that kind of technology. So it's great to have a full open source alternative, let's say. And in the case of the other talk, I was wondering, about RICAN. How would you contrast the approach or the kind of target market? I know this would have been a question for the speaker, but since you attended and you know broadly the market, how would you contrast their approach compared, let's say, to EVOS at LF Edge?
I think they're potentially very similar, and I'm not sure. The WeirCan really literally going to this conference was the first I've heard of it, and I believe that it's extremely new. And I think that for now anyway, the EVOS does not use that, at least in what I've seen before, I don't think it uses that secure compute platform. I don't know that there's any impediment that would stop them from using it. But I think that the WeirCan was a spinoff of NARCS, which was a project specifically aligned with the secure compute. And what they wanted was a way, once they had this secure compute, and in other words, an ability to run VMs that are encrypted VMs. I am new to this, but what encrypted VMs means, I believe, is that even if you were a hardware hacker and you could somehow tamper with the hardware and get into the live memory image, that what you'd find there isn't anything readable. You could, you could run one of these theoretically at some completely unattended location where somebody goes in there and cuts through the lid with a saw and starts putting logic probes in there to try to intercept the CPU to memory path, and maybe you still can't get anything valuable. So I believe that the WeirCan started with the orientation of them just needing a way to boot into these encrypted VMs on bare metal, and it was made to serve that purpose. It's a little different from EVOS in that it runs, I think, as an architectural limitation entirely in memory. And I don't think EVOS has that limitation at all. And there are ways that people contend that you achieve your security with the TPM module in conjunction with the UEFI BIOS and the right OS. So I'm the wrong person to give it a grade on whether this is better or worse.
And really that was more kind of feature comparison, not I would say that not a quality comparison, because you would have to implement the thing in the real world. But thank you for those insights. I think one of the potential differentiators is that since EVOS is relying on an hypervisor, a level 1, it can run VMs and containers. So that's probably one possible differentiation. But anyway, it's got me thinking, and that's the whole point of presentations.
I almost think that maybe the two might, as often happens in open source, still adopt useful features out of the other one. So this really is the first I ever heard of the ability to package the kernel in an OCI container. But now that I know it's there, I don't see why this couldn't be done over in EVOS. And it's a cool idea, because as use of these registries become ubiquitous, there's a lot of people who are extending these OCI containers to put WebAssemblies in there, for example, or there are a number of container registry open source projects that got enhanced to have them also host Helm charts, for example. So it's almost becoming the jack of all trades, if you will, for Edge, particularly if you want to run air-gapped. But actually, even if you don't require air-gap, but you don't have very good upstream internet connectivity there, or if you wanted to impose a governance layer, having this host of generic binaries for various purposes is something that I think people find they want to do when they go at edge at scale.
Yeah, I think
And
so.
just packaging the OSs in OCI, I think, is a concept. This is the first I've ever heard of it. And even legacy boot technologies like Pixie or something, if you, once I heard of that idea, I'm going, geez, couldn't somebody do that? And they probably can.
Yes.
And by the way, I said when I was talking about the WeirCan that I'd mentioned why it's on GitLab, but it turned out that GitLab has a facility to host things using, it's willing to do legacy TLS, which GitHub is not.
Mhm.
And apparently a lot of Pixie boot hardware that is not sufficiently evolved to use the newer TLS. So they chose to locate the WeirCan project on GitLab just because you can actually check in your images there and use it as a Pixie boot source, which
Interesting.
I thought was pretty cool.
Yes.
And they've got pre-built images that contain Ubuntu and some of the popular Linux variants.
All right. So thank you for that. And to come back to the conference, in any case, I had a great time, and it was nice to see you in person. That was the first time that we were actually seeing each other. And as I said, I'm looking forward to submit a paper for next year, and I discussed this with my colleague at Augustin at the OnEuro working group, and we are certainly looking at having a booth and making a bigger splash even for next year. So thank you for introducing me to the event. It's been a great experience.
Okay. So the next item on the agenda that I put there was I was aspiring to do a demo of Argo tunnels at Edge, but I'm traveling. And I found that my VPN connection into my house is down, so I can't do a live demo. So I'm just going to talk about it. But these Argo tunnels are this interesting concept where it's a way to publish something. I started doing this just for kind of home lab things, but it makes a lot of sense at Edge as well. The typical thing you do if you're running at home and you wanted to host a web page or a dashboard or something like that would be to use NAT and, you know, open a exposed port on the public internet that your firewall forwards through to whatever app you configure. The concept of this tunnel is a little different in that you run an agent on the host that you attempt to expose. And this could be, you know, it could be Kubernetes, or it could be on a container runtime, or it could be even a bare metal app running on something as small as a Raspberry Pi. And I was so curious about the resource requirements of this that if I was able to do the demo today, I was going to demo a software-defined radio app that is monitoring air traffic in Los Angeles running on a Pi 3 that only has 1 gig of RAM. And the tunnel worked fine for that. It runs a little agent app that goes and opens up a network forwarding to a local host port on, you know, the destination you're trying to expose, routes it to Cloudflare's CDN locations. I don't believe you get to choose. I think they just pick one for you, but Cloudflare has these points of presence all over, and it exposes it on Cloudflare. So you can then create a DNS entry that routes to the Cloudflare IP, and people connect to that IP and port, and Cloudflare forwards it down to your edge device. And it means that you have successfully exposed some app or service on the public internet, and you haven't even divulged your IP. If you go at it, if somebody looks up this DNS name, it's terminated at Cloudflare. And if you want, they will actually provide an SSL cert for it, or a TLS cert, so that you don't necessarily have to go with something like Let's Encrypt to put a certificate on it. And in fact, if you're on a low resource device, it could run relatively safely just using HTTP. And, you know, if you're really challenged CPU wise, that might be a benefit because it could have trouble keeping up with, you know, the additional workload of a TLS connection. And I was able to get it to expose out of a bare metal Raspberry Pi. I've gotten it to expose out of VMs. And I believe you can actually even use it to front for a Kubernetes load balance service. Or I did not get so far as to front a Kubernetes ingress, but I believe it should work. But I just didn't get to the point of successfully trying it yet. But I did do Kubernetes load balance services and get it to expose those. At a certain point, Cloudflare isn't doing this as a charity, they charge for it. However, you can get a free account, and I believe it gives you, the free tier lets you do about 5 of these tunnels or something. You better look it up, I'm not sure on the exact count, but you, on the free tier, you can get several, let's put it that way. And I think the paid tier adds some features as well, where you can have Cloudflare hosting user authentication, you know, where instead of it being just wide open to everybody who happens to have the URL, you could, Cloudflare would run an authentication process with a login or something for you. And you'd have to pay the money to get up to that level. But I'd encourage you, I was kind of surprised at how well the free tier worked. And I think a lot of edge, if you're going to expose something from an edge location, you do have a problem there. I mean, if you've got limited resource, it's probably pretty trivial for a bot network to send a denial of service attack your way and knock you off for practical purposes, because the, you know, how sturdy is a limited resource edge device going to be from SYN attacks and volume and things? Not very, in my opinion. But by moving it up kind of to a tier hosted by a CDN, I think that you've kind of elevated your game a bit there. Now, there is something, if people are familiar with the open source community, there's a guy named Alex Ellis who's very big in so-called event-driven and serverless, who came up with a project called Inlets that I think is a similar concept, where you run a lightweight agent on your edge device and pop it out somewhere on the public internet that is a little bit higher horsepower, if you will, in terms of resource. And Inlets, the compare there is that Alex isn't doing it as a charity, but it's very inexpensive. And he doesn't have this tied in with a particular service provider. So it can run the other end, the cloud hosted edge of your tunnel in all the public clouds. You choose to stand up the public exposed agent. It could be in Azure, it could be in GCP, it could be in AWS, DigitalOcean, whatever. So it opens a tunnel from your edge device up to the agent running in a public cloud. And the public cloud would expose a public IP that people would utilize to get to the edge hosted service. And I think when I put the things in the notes, I didn't have time before the meeting to put a note there, but if you Google for Inlets and tunnel, I think you'll find it. And I think that one doesn't have a free tier, but it's like $5 a month. So it isn't super expensive just to go pay for an account for a short time if you wanted to try it. And the Cloudflare one, like I say, you just need an email to go register for a free tier account. So that was the end of what I had put on the agenda. I think we have a standing item on the agenda until we get done with our white paper discussion. So I'll mute my mic and turn it over to Kate Dion, Brandon, tell me if I've missed anything.
Sure, I can talk a little bit about the white paper. So I think our last meeting, we discussed kind of next steps on getting some writers involved. I posted on the Slack a couple days ago to see if folks are interested in participating as writers, and haven't heard a ton of responses there, but we are still having some conversation threads on the white paper itself. So I think a big step that we need to solidify is coming up with those principles and defining what are the edge native principles. And then there's been some discussions around what areas of the edge are we going to focus on: the near edge, the far edge, the tiny edge, dark edge, and how it seems to be a kind of a network focus based on the expertise of the draft. But that we do want to aim for still far edge is kind of the discussion that's going now. So really just need to transition into defining those principles, and maybe we need a separate meeting to chat about that, what those principles are, or keep that in the document. But anyone's free to add onto that. Brandon, I don't know if you have any updates or thoughts on it as well.
Thanks for that, Kate. No additional thoughts other than I see Amar weighed in, looks like earlier today from India, with his thoughts about potentially including the far edge, but maybe stopping there. Tiny might be a little outside of our scope. I would tend to agree with that, but would want to get input from other contributors, reviewers, and authors if that's the logical division that we should be making. And then, as to your other point around principles, tried to get started with some of those listed below in the outline, but I think that's an important piece that we need to confirm, and also add in anything that's missing. Maybe an open brainstorm with the group or a separate call would be good for that. This is an important milestone, I think, for us around this topic. So I just wouldn't want to miss any principles that we think could and should be covered.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And also one thing that we kind of skipped over, that's an important announcement, but as part of this white paper, we submitted a talk to KubeCon North America to present kind of our progress on the white paper, whether it's completed at that point. At least in the least, we should have those principles really nailed down. And that talk was accepted. And so, which is very exciting. But that also means we kind of gives us that energy to kind of nail down those principles. And I can, if someone hasn't, I can go ahead and link the document here for folks who may not have it yet. Does anyone have any other general comments about it? Because we can also, if we have this extra 24 minutes, we can move into kind of discussing those principles and having somewhat of a brainstorm here and see if we need to go on and continue that in a separate meeting or asynchronously.
One thing I'd maybe suggest, Kate, is as we identify the principles, to try to come up with a somewhat concise name for each one, because right now they're listed as sentences of varying lengths. Maybe we try to adopt a standard of a principle name that is a bit shorter, that's maybe encompassing of what the principle entails, with then a follow-up sentence or two behind it to detail that principle. Just thinking in terms of consumability from a web page or a GitHub page or a PDF. I think we want those principles to stand out a little bit more and just be the starter of recognition that then is followed up with more information.
Yeah, I agree with that. So on that note, we can kind of work our way down them for folks who have this open. The first principle is end-tier applications that span from the edge to the cloud. So to me, and Brandon, I know you sketch these out, so might be best if you follow up. I can give my interpretations of these, which might be helpful for kind of nailing them down. But to me, this sounds like kind of creating a continuum of the edge so that your same application can be deployed in all these different zones, whether that's the near edge, far edge, or the cloud. Is that what you would say this first bullet point is?
Yeah, that's my understanding of it.
So to me, that summarizes portability. I don't know if that's the right word. Or portable, I guess, if we're describing an application.
Yes. Yeah.
But it's maybe not just portable, it's maybe that the parts of the application needs to live on different different tiers, right? So some of it is on the air, some of it's in the cloud.
Yeah, this is rather about distribution and the fact that you can really move pieces around in the appropriate tier dynamically or something like that.
Okay, so in this, we're talking about the application as it can span multiple different. So I'm curious then, should portable be a separate principle? Like, should you be able to interchange what part of the spectrum of computing each part of your application's on, or is that not what we consider an important principle?
It's tricky there because I can see a theoretical interest in it, but then the problem with that is that, of course, the farther away you get from the cloud into the wild, the lesser is your elasticity, and of course that means that you may have typically in our own messaging, we say that the edge is a pretty heterogeneous environment. So if you want things to be really portable, you get a level of complexity there because of that, right? If you target, let's say, small edge nodes with AI accelerators, very far from the data center, of course, whatever container or microservice or whatever you will deploy, if you take advantage of that and then suddenly you run in a completely different environment on a different processor architecture, then you won't be as optimized. So to a point, yes, you want to shuffle things and things to be fairly portable, but to what degree there's a very big price to pay if you want this to be ultimately I can run anywhere, everywhere, right?
Right. The portability has limits. We still have defined architectures and
yes.
So okay.
But it's whatever you make that a core principle or not, I think it's an interesting aspect to tackle for sure. And maybe you don't need to have the definitive answer to that, because ultimately it's 3 years from now when everyone will have done it, and you will see the results of various approaches there. But it's an important consideration.
So I'm writing these in the bullets, but I think we'll move them elsewhere to not clutter the outline maybe later. But the way I defined what you just summarized was we want it to be portable with limits. So you want to be able to lift and shift things, but applications are still relatively tied to architectures.
Yeah. Yeah, they have expectations about capabilities, let's say, or something like that would be the way I would phrase it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and I think capabilities actually is a really interesting word on the edge that I've heard tossed around. I think that should be tied into one of the principles of capability focused might be something.
Yeah, you're on something there.
Because I know, but this is coming from a tiny edge perspective, which we might exclude. But when you're thinking about interacting with the tiny edge, your far edge applications are sometimes capability focused, and the word capability extends to those tiny IoT devices around those smaller size servers. So
yep.
I guess I'll add that, but we can maybe toggle based on whether that's in scope. So to summarize, so for end-tier applications that span from edge to cloud, it sounds like we're landing on, for this one, a focus of the discussion around the fact that the application itself, or the larger application, exists across all these different parts of the edge.
Mm.
Okay. And what are things that need to be taken into account because of this? That isn't a part of traditional cloud native computing. So what is the extension?
Trying to think about this.
So I guess we can distinguish between the application as a whole and the services in that application, right? So the services needs to be portable, but applications is by the definition, yeah, not multi-cloud, but multi-edge, right?
Yeah, or
multi-locations.
yeah, well, provider agnostic or something like that. Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And then I didn't have a full look at the outline or anything. I think I missed the previous meeting or something, but certainly you have to make the assumptions about, you are fully distributed, which means that you fully expect the network to fail, degrade, and all of that. That's something that will have ultimately even an impact on your code, depending on the class of application, right? But if you're expecting to be able, let's say you're doing AI and you have a cloud-based error function for outliers and things like that, then you have to bake in the assumption that maybe that outside help won't be available all the time, or could not perform to expected standards all the time.
So there, are you
So
saying?
I'm not sure how to synthesize that, but
are you saying lower your standards for the edge, essentially?
That's a bad way to
I mean, that's kind of what I heard.
But I like the formula at the same time, because yes, it has a ring to it, but you need to explain but yes, I think that's a catchy way to express it.
I think maybe a nicer way to say that is aware of intermittent connectivity, or yeah. So maybe more of lower availability, because we think of high availability with the cloud, and maybe it's lower availability.
Or variable availability could be, because that's the thing, you never know what could happen. It could be a complete outage. It could be degradation in the environment. Yeah, for example, I live in a place where we've got good cell connectivity most of the time, but when there's a power outage, everyone suddenly falls onto the cellular network, and then suddenly latency goes, through the roof. So that's one typical example.
Great. And then feel free to keep throwing out more ideas, even if they aren't on the outline itself. Another point that we have up next is vendor neutral paths. So something that is orchestrating all of this, that under the hoods, you can swap things in and out. So for example, you could use Kubernetes, Istio, etc. This is interesting. So I think for all of this, we're defining application as like the larger application or the larger solution you're creating, which I think is proper, because that's kind of, it's not really helpful to talk about one part of the edge that links into some and just in its isolation. But do people have thoughts on this one, or maybe cases like this paragraph? We probably don't want to call out a certain project, like we're trying to be independent here. but maybe we could, since coming out of the CNCF, mention several CNCF projects that kind of provide this solution.
I think it's fair game to at least provide examples, and people can make up their mind about the specific projects. I can certainly provide the Eclipse perspective on that one as well. And I think there the one point that I would reinforce, and that was one of the tenets in my talk that Steve talked about, was that you know, the very first slide in that talk was literally answering the question: do you need to bring Kubernetes if you're doing something at the edge? And the answer was maybe ? And this is because, depending on what you have in mind, it could make sense to have a control plane, or even, you know, in a field data center, or even Kubernetes on actual edge nodes, very, very far away from the cloud, right? But it all goes down to your use case, your expectations, your requirements. And so you shouldn't be afraid of mix and matching, in the sense that not only you need to think this about vendor neutral paths, but you should be blinded by a single platform. You should pick the right platform for the type of environment, and then make sure that they integrate together. So in our case at Eclipse, we have for example, IOFog, which is something, you know, for container orchestration at the edge that you would use instead of, let's say, K3s or KubeEdge or something like that, but will integrate with remote Kubernetes control plane, for example. You know, for some use cases, it makes sense. And I'm not saying that this is the architecture, right? Because it's my own baby project or anything, but you shouldn't be afraid of, you know, testing approaches like that and leveraging them when it makes sense.
I think that's a really good point. And another point I would add to that is that kind of what you all are doing there in that scenario of having Kubernetes, which was made for the cloud, exist in the cloud, and then use something else on the edge, is one option. Another option is those cloud technologies have evolved to the edge. So another option is to take the edge version of things that have kind of just been slimmed down, like K3s. And then the third option is to take the things that originally cloud but kind of modified for the edge, like KubeEdge, which really broke up Kubernetes architecture a little.
Yeah.
So I think this section could kind of just be a discussion around options.
Yeah, exactly. And those three basic approaches that you describe are a good way to tackle it. And then for each, you can mention projects that are examples of that particular approach without specifically recommending one, but in a project perspective, certainly.
Okay.
Maybe even we can mention in this area that this kind of approach would allow you to evolve your big edge application by allowing you to add more edge nodes, which are, you know, changing over time. So maybe you started with something that's just plain containers, and then you can do somewhere a full, you know, 3-node cluster or something like that, or add VASM in the future, or whatever, right? So
Yes.
You're not tying yourself for the future evolution of the platform.
Yeah, you get built-in flexibility in the architecture, which is an important concern. And then the corollary to that is that, you know, from a developer perspective, you want, of course, to do DevOps, but you would do, let's say, continuous integration, but not necessarily continuous deployment, especially if you have real-time mission-critical applications running, right? It's not the time to patch all of those smart cars stuck on the interstate at 4:30 p.m. In the middle of a traffic jam, for example. Or maybe the traffic jam is a good place to patch them before they pick up some speed. I don't know. But I think that connection to the developer concerns is important, in the sense that you shouldn't blindly assume that because you know how to build cloud native apps and deploy them and monitor them and all of that, and your reliability engineering and all of that, that you will do exactly the same thing at the edge. That's an important paradigm shift that you need to take into account.
That makes sense. Moving on to the next one, it says at scale management paradigm with vendor agnostic monitoring techniques. This is somewhat related to the previous. But it's, I guess, one layer lower of saying like you need something orchestrating this and monitoring it. So I guess this is kind of maybe what you're plugging into your pass. But
Yeah,
or maybe
maybe
this-
it's a sub point of the previous section, in the sense that you care not just about the orchestration part, but about the monitoring and control and everything.
I think these should be separated into two. Like I think monitoring needs its own bullet.
Mhm.
I don't know.
So maybe in 2 words, centrally monitored, right? Centrally observable.
Ooh, nice.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation, Dion.
Thanks for pulling us back into doing that. I forgot about that. I like that a lot. I think that kind of explains itself, but is there anything that's kind of a must have? Like, I mean, we could just mention here like dashboards, maybe UIs. I guess what the management part is bringing to it is that where you're centrally observing things, maybe you want to centrally be able to take actions. But I still think those should be separated up.
Yeah, to me, the later one is the previous point, right? So we have some kind of pass that I mean, it's implied into previous one that we have something that will centrally manage everything. And now we're discussing that it should manage different kind of things and work with different passes, right? So
what would our one word for the pass one be? Should it be vendor neutral pass, or should it be like management at scale?
yeah.
Was there one of those in particular you liked, Brandon?
Between the two, maybe management at scale is
We can-
more specific to what we're getting at here. Yeah, I don't know a better way in which to call out vendor neutral pass as a distinct thing from that.
And I think we can continue to get votes in there, but it's nice to have this one word and maybe have some options.
Yeah, you will fine tune the wording a bit
Yeah.
later in the process.
Like management at scale is more the what, and vendor neutral pass is more of the how.
Good point. Great. So moving on to the next one, automatic instantiation or termination using declarative intent. Okay. So to me, this sounds like being able to say, I want this many replicas when this happens. I want this to happen. Some triggers in your system that kick off automatic actions. And then also it says application optimization. So to me, that sounds like your application knows when to sleep or when to go down and when to come back up. It sounds like there might be a lot in this one.
Yeah, we might want to break it up.
It kind of sounds like Kata to me, almost like the Kubernetes equivalent of this.
Yeah,
like,
you have infrastructure as code inside there, and then you have more of a real-time optimization issue as well. So maybe that's the way to break them up: runtime concerns versus declaration concerns, so to speak.
Okay, I kind of added, I think what could go along with this that I would love to include in the paper is some sort of concept of not always running everything. I know with cloud-based infrastructures, sometimes your container is always churning. But I've heard over many KubeCons a lot of talks that are about orchestrators that can stop services when they're no longer needed and restart them. I think that's because of the restrained resources on the edge. I think that would be something that's a nice to have, is the ability to kind of turn things off when you no longer need them to restrict resource usage. But I don't know if that's a paradigm. But
I think you need to see it in a broader sense, in the sense maybe you have excess capacity that you can put to good use when the normal workload is lower. And I'm not saying you should mine Bitcoin while you're waiting for actual requests to come, but there are scenarios where maybe you can take advantage of that capacity that you have in the field to do something else rather than the main workload when the main workload is lower. Longer term optimization problems, you could run some AI models to provide additional value. Let's say you're doing video analytics, for example. You have the normal use case, let's say, of preventing shoplifting. And let's say you can do some market research AI, so to speak, whenever you have downtime or something like that. At night, for example, when the store is closed, maybe you run a different set of models and provide additional value that way, for example. I'm just making this up, but I could see totally that happening.
yeah, I like that. Well, we're at time. I believe there is one more, which I'm not, so I would love to just do the last one. But if people need to hop off, totally understand.
Yeah, in my case, that would be the case. But in any case, I will keep an eye on the outline, and maybe if I have other ideas, put them in. And since I wasn't there, yeah, I'm finishing writing a book and things like that. I have so many things to write. Unfortunately, I may not be able to contribute directly, but in any case, I'm happy to be involved in this effort and provide feedback and, of course, review whenever it makes sense. And if by miracle I get additional capacity, maybe pitch in, but I'm already in trouble.
No worries, you've already pitched in. And yeah, we have a little reviewers bullet at the bottom. So feel free to add yourself there if you want to just review the paper.
Of course.
I'm going to have to drop too. So I think I made several of you co-hosts so that the meeting, even though I opened it, should continue on, but just in case it drops, that's what happened. But I think you'll be okay.
I think we can save this last one then for the next meeting. And it'll kick us off. And we can call that a great review of what we have. So that was a good use of time, I feel like. So I appreciate everyone kind of chipping into that discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. Great progress.
Okay, bye everybody.
For driving. Yeah.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.